Hello and welcome to the Big Dumb Networking Dude channel. I do not need to go and be like, hey, it's been a while. It's obvious it's been a while. You guys can see the last time I uploaded and quite a bit of time has passed and I apologize for that. I'm not going to try to give you any cheeky excuses onto what I was doing. I just really suck at uploading content sometimes. It's always in the back of my mind. I'm always like, I should make a video on that. But it's not always that easy. But today I am back. I am making another video, or really a two-part series on this one, and that is deploying Cisco Secure Firewall, or FTDv, in Azure. As a whole, I've actually had quite a few customers and clients lately ask me about how to go about this. They were trying to do this, they've hit some issues, and to be honest, some of the documentation on this just flat out sucks. And a lot of the videos that are out there are a bit outdated. I feel like some of them kind of gloss over the fact, like they'll just be like, oh yeah, just set up NAT. And while it might be intuitive for some, they don't really go into the actual details and give any kind of screenshots on what that looks like, whether it's through FDM, FMC, or really, how we can even get in and connect to our firewall in Azure. So that's what I'm here to do. This here right now is part one. Part one, we are going to cover kind of what the architecture is. We are going to do the initial deployment and then a very bare bones setup of connectivity. Then in part two, we are going to have a couple of applications. I believe I've got WordPress and Nextcloud deployed up in a couple Linux VMs in Azure, and we're going to kind of go through the process on what it would look like to access those as if they were public applications, and we have that north-south traffic. And then we can also set up some different ACLs and rules for any kind of east-west traffic to say, like, maybe for some reason your WordPress site needs to, talk to Nextcloud. And then again, we can kind of see that traffic and that segmentation. So we'll set up the different routing, the UDRs, the ACLs, and NATs in part two. But like I said, part one here, we are just going to get in and get this thing deployed. So let's go ahead and jump into that right now. Before we get into the actual configuration and how to deploy the FTV in Azure, I think it's kind of important to go over the quote-unquote underlying plumbing and kind of how I have my VNet with subnet set up. And again, this is in a traditional hub and spoke topology. I don't have the other, VNets or subscriptions called out in this diagram, but we can just assume that they do exist in a typical production environment. So as we go and we do the actual deployment process, you are more than welcome to create the VNet and subnets at that time, but I like to get things created ahead of time, and then we can kind of go over how I kind of go about doing that. And there are a lot of videos already out there on the internet showing you how to go through that process. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to talk about it kind of at a high level. So I do have a VNet. It is called Landing Zone Plus, I believe, within my Azure tenant. And within that, we have a couple of subnets. We have our outside subnet, which we are going to associate with the outside NIC of the FTD. We have our management subnet, where again the management NIC is going to be placed, and that is how we are going to be connecting to the FTDv after it has been deployed. I am not going to put a public IP address on this. We'll be connecting to it via its private IP. I also have a diagnostic subnet as well as our inside subnet. This subnet is going to be where we will be pointing a lot of our user-defined routes from our different application subnets, from different VNets, so that we are able to then force the traffic through the FTDv to provide that east-west as well as north-south inspection. I also, within my environment, have a gateway subnet that is hosting a site-to-site tunnel back to my house, where I am able to then, again, we're going to access that management subnet on its private IP via FDM. There are multiple ways we could manage an FTDv in Azure. One of them being through FMC. I do have FMC stood up, but I think it's at like 7.4, and I'm going to be deploying a 7.7 code firewall, and so it will not onboard to my current FMC. We could also onboard it with Cisco Security Cloud. I might make a separate video at some point in time switching over to that management interface to see what that looks like, or we can manage it locally via FDM. And I guess technically there is a fourth option if you wanted to deploy a FMCV somewhere up here. You could do that and then use something like a Bastion host or a jump box to be able to access that GUI, but that is just more things that have to spin up in Azure and more costs, and I don't really feel like doing that. And lastly, real quick before we get into the deployment, we are going to have a couple of app subnets. I traditionally would never deploy those for in a production environment within my landing zone VNet. They would kind of be off in their own application specific VNet or subscription. But in this case, just to kind of show how we're going to pass traffic, I did it this way to make it a little bit easier. But these two app subnets will be hosting our, well, this should be app 2, the applications that we are going to expose to the internet. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the deployment. All right, so you're going to want to head over to the Azure portal and click on Marketplace or Search Marketplace up here. Then we're going to search for Cisco Secure Firewall, and we are going to want the Secure Firewall Threat Defense Virtual, bring your own license, and pay as you go, which is kind of a cool option. Cisco doesn't offer that with all their virtual offerings in Azure, but on the firewall side, you can, again, bring your own license, and then the pay-as-you-go is obviously going to be a little bit more expensive because as part of that pay-as-you-go, you are also paying for the licenses as well as, and of course, the infrastructure costs that is going to go to Azure, whereas to bring your own license, you're just paying that Azure cost. So let's go ahead and create that. Takes a minute for some reason to spin up, but here we go. So resource group. Now for this, the firewall does need to get deployed into an empty resource group or to create a new one. I do have an empty resource group here, device FTDv RG. So I'm going to select that one. Region, that's going to be applicable to wherever you are in the world. For me, East US makes the most sense. We will call this FTDv YouTube 1. We're going to be using the bring your own licensing software version. I'm going to deploy this at 7.7, but you can choose what works best for you in your given scenario and features that you need. Availability zone, I'm going to set this none for this deployment because it is just a singular box. I'm not trying to do HA or anything like that. If you were to do HA, you might want to specify, or not you might, you definitely would want to specify the availability zone in which this is deployed, and you obviously would not want to deploy each one of your boxes in the same availability zone. You'd want to split them across that region. Next is the user's name. So this is not the admin account. This is a user account for within the firewall. So we're going to select one username and then give that a password. And then for admin access, this is the admin account that you will be using from a management perspective to log on to the box. So if you're using FDM like we are going to be doing in this tutorial, then this is the password for that one. There we go. So, and then from a management perspective, how are we managing this? For this, we are going to use FDM, Firepower Device Management, so the local GUI. But again, you're more than welcome to use FMC if that is what you choose. So next, let's go into the settings of this. So this right now, I think, is the smallest size we can do within Azure from a virtual machine standpoint. So yeah, we're gonna keep with that because that will also be the cheapest. From a storage account, so I have already created a storage account, and that's what I'm going to use. For some reason, I don't know if it's a bug within the Azure portal right now, but I was having a lot of issues when I was standing some stuff up for a customer, creating a new one during this process. It was just giving me a lot of crap. So I usually create one ahead of time and this associate it that way. So public IP address. This is the public IP address that would be associated with that management NIC, and we do not want that. So I'm going to say none here because we are going to be hitting it again on its private IP address through that site-to-site tunnel. Attach a diagnostics interface. Yep, we'll go ahead and do that. So virtual network, again, this is where I said you can go ahead and create the entire thing from scratch if you want to, but I like to plan out things a little bit ahead of time. So I'm going to say we're going to the landing zone plus. Management is going to get the management subnet. Diagnostics will get the where diag subnet. 00 is your outside address, so that is going to be your outside subnet, and then 01 is the inside, so that will be our inside. And then public inbound ports for the management interface, I will go and add that in after the fact. I'm not going to do it in this point right now. So tags, if you tag your stuff, go ahead and tag it accordingly. I don't need to for this given scenario. And then we are going to lastly go to review and create. So it's going to go through and check and make sure everything is good and happy. And let's go ahead and hit create. That is going to take a minute to get that up and going. So I will pause the video here, and we will be back once it is up and running and we're able to connect to the management GUI on it. So our firewall has been deployed now. We can go to the resource group and look at the different resources we have here. Even though it is deployed, it does sometimes take a bit for the firewall to spin all the way up and give you access to FDM. So we're going to take care of a couple housekeeping items before we do that, before we try to connect to it. So first thing we need to do is we need to allow connectivity into the security group, the NSG, that is on the management NIC of the FTD. So by default, we do have these rules in here already, but the traffic that is going to be coming from my house is, not within this virtual network, so it's not already allowed. So let's go ahead and go to settings. We'll go inbound security rules, and we're going to add a new one. So for our source, we will have IP addresses, and we're going to say 10.0.2.0/26. That is the IP space that I am currently on right now from my desktop. That is my trusted VLAN or subnet within my home network. So that is what's going to be going over the tunnel to talk to this. And we'll just say any destination. We can get as granular as we want to when it comes to a lot of these rules. So we could just say we're only going to allow it to be on this NIC, but being that this security, I'm not going to associate this security group or this NSG to any other devices. So it's really only going to affect this given NIC. So I'm going to say, okay, for anything for destination. For service, we'll say custom. And I'm actually going to put any rule for the port range. That is just because, again, it's easier. I might try to hit this on SSH at some point. It gives me 443, HTTPS access to it. So we're just going to do that. And then down here, just for the sake of it, I will change this. I'll just say trusted home, any inbound, and we will go ahead and add that. So cool. Now we have that added. So we do have a rule in place to get access to our firewall. Let's actually go back to the FTD itself and look at what our IP is going to be that we're going to hit this on. So it looks like we are going to be using 1035.4 as our management IP that we will again be connecting via FDM. So that is good to know. The last thing we need to have, and I do have this already in place, but I will show you just for the sake of any gotchas, is let's go to our landing plus virtual network. We need to make sure we have a route back to our home network or to my home network to ensure that we can have that connectivity across that site to site tunnel. It's not going to just be there by default. So again, we have our different subnets, right? So, and then for our management subnet, you can see we already have route table management subnet RTB connected to it. So within that route table, we got a couple of routes. We have our route to get to our FMC if we're going to be using that. I have used that in the past to test some things, so that's why that route exists. And then lastly, we have our trusted home route. And then our next hop is that virtual network gateway. So that is how we are able to get that, again, that traffic across. So we need to make sure we have this route table associated to our management. And again, this will be different for each use case. This is just the use case that I am displaying. This is probably good for a lab environment. Honestly, for production, I wouldn't really want to expose my management port publicly either. So I would probably do this from a production environment as well. So we got our route tables. We have our NSG that we are allowing the connectivity in on. So let's see if FDM is up and running yet. So let's go HTTPS 1035.4, and it looks like we do. It is up and going. Come on, proceed. So our GUI is up and going. Let's go ahead and log in here, admin. And we should be greeted with the first time setup. So, okay, so it looks like we jumped the gun a little bit. It's still going through the setup process. So I will pause the video and jump back into it once it's ready to go. Now we are up and going. So let's go ahead and do some initial configuration, being that this is a part one of a two-part series. I'm not going to get it all up and running to where we have, north, south, east, west traffic going from different applications, but we're going to get the box pretty much ready to rock and roll for that second part. So let's go. So the outside interface, yep, configuring that via DHCP is fine. Let's hit next. And also, nope, no IPv6 on this one. So that part of the settings is set up. We're getting this connection failed. That is expected. I mean, we don't even have a route going out of this yet. So let's crawl, walk, run on this. So let's set this up to my area. So we'll go American Detroit. NTP servers, I'll use a different one, and we will use time.nist.gov. Gov. Next. For this, obviously, this is a lab YouTube video, so I'm just going to use the evaluation period, pick a tier. I think this is like FTDv 20. Yeah, FTDv 20. So we'll say that's fine. And we will say finish. And for this device, we're going to use this as a standalone device, but as I mentioned earlier, we can set this up with Cisco Security Cloud, and I might again make another video about that at a later time, but standalone device at this point in time. So let's do a couple things here. So in terms of interfaces, so we should be good on our external interface, or outside is good. It's getting DHCP from Azure, and it's within that subnet we expect. Management is good, obviously, because we're connecting to it. But for our internal, we actually don't want, we want this to get it via DHCP, but it's trying to actually by default act as a DHCP server for this inside network. So let's go ahead and edit that. Let's delete the DHCP pool from it. And then let's say we want this to be DHCP. And we're going to say OK. And now that we've made some changes, let's go ahead and deploy those really quickly before we move on to the routing. All right, we are good to go. And as you can see, we are now getting that inside subnet IP via DHCP through Azure. So next thing we want to do is we want to add a route. So let's go to our viewer configuration. Let's create a static route, and we will call this default route out. Interface is going to be outside. If this ever loads. Networks, we are going to say any. IPv4. Gateway. We need to select it. We need to create a new object for this gateway. So I'm going to call this outside gateway. So this is the gateway within Azure that is in that subnet of our outside interface. So anytime within Azure, if you create a subnet, the .1 is going to be the gateway for that subnet. So in our case, it is going to be 10.0.34.1. That is the gateway. So we're going to say OK. Outside gateway is what we want. And again, we will say OK. So again, we made some changes. We need to deploy that. So we're going to deploy that right now. And while that is deploying, we're going to hop back over to the Azure portal because there's one thing we need to do to make sure we get outbound connectivity. So we'll deploy that now. Let's come back to Azure. Let's go back to our firewall resource group. And we want to look at NIC 2 here. So this is the NIC of the outside interface. And we are going to go to IP configurations. And as you can see, this NIC does not have a public IP address. So we are going to want to associate a public IP address with it so that we can get external connectivity. So let's edit this one. There we go, sorry. We're going to associate a public IP address. We don't have one, so we are going to create a public IP address. And we will call this outside main. Outside main pip. Stick with some of my nomenclature naming. And we will save. And let's hop back to our FTD. So that is deployed. Let's go back here. We're going to give this just a minute. We should see the WAN gateway come up green here. And when that happens, we will call that a wrap for the day. And it did take a couple minutes for that public IP to, I guess, fully get associated within the Azure network, which then our firewall could then leverage to get outside. But as you can see now, we now have WAN connectivity out to the internet. So that is all we're going to cover in this initial video. And then in part 2, we will get the applications up and going and accessible from the public internet. And that's really the quick and dirty of it on how to get this thing deployed and get our initial connectivity set up. So that really does wrap up part 1 here. Part 2, I hope to have out in the next day or so. And like I said in the intro, that's where we're going to be kind of looking at some app connectivity and setting up the rules and the NAT and the different things to allow communication to kind of be forced through this head-end firewall there in Azure. And in the meantime, if there is anything else, if there's another function, another feature that the Cisco Secure Firewall might have that you want to see, maybe I can add that to part 2. So if that is something you would like to see, go ahead and leave a comment. Say, hey man, I'd like to see X, Y, and Z, and I'll try to include that in the video. And if it comes later down the road as these things get viewed, I can do maybe a part 3 as a kind of a bolt-on to look at some of the different features. So that is a wrap. Go ahead and make sure you guys keep labbing and stay classy out there.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!